Monoco has the highest number of skills by far, and this mechanic needs you to be prepared to use a variety of skills to benefit from the massive mask bonus. So in this video, I will evaluate every single skill by mask type, damage and other key nuances to make sure you're equipped with the best options, no matter how the wheel spins. Starting with heavy mask skills. First off, we have Stalact Punches. This is a starting ability that deals mediocre single target damage with increased break potency. The bracketed number in the tooltips that you see here are the break damage multipliers, and this ability actually has an unusually high multiplier of 150%, whereas most skills range between 10 and 100%. This seems pretty cool, but break damage is based on the actual damage dealt, and just dealing high damage will naturally fill the break bar pretty quickly. The skill will deal damage equal to around 600% of your attack power with perfect inputs, which is pretty mediocre, so that high break multiplier just won't get that much value. And by the way, if you want a better overview of all skills damage numbers with perfect QuickTime event bonus, make sure to check out my spreadsheet in the description. Early on you will notice the skill breaking enemies more quickly, but you should replace this as soon as possible with higher damage abilities. The saving grace of the skill is that you won't have better options right after unlocking Monoco, so I'll give it a C tier, but it will get outclassed pretty quickly. And then we have Rocher Hammering, a low cost, low damage ability that can break, but Monoco has so many break options and this one just doesn't have anything going for it. D tier. And then next up, Grosse Tete Whack, I guess. This is a single target ability that applies defenseless and deals terrible damage. For some reason, the skill only gets a double damage mask multiplier rather than triple on top of having low base damage. The defenseless is also applied on the last hit rather than the first, so it doesn't synergize with itself, which feels like a lost opportunity. But the biggest disappointment is that it doesn't increase the hit count with each use. Unlike the big enemy Tetes that use this move, those start bouncing like 50 times per attack after using it a few times, but Monoco's version is just complete garbage, so D tier. And then we have Hexga Crush. This skill is very similar to Grosse Tete Whack. Single target, applies defenseless, terrible damage, and it manages to even be worse because its mask upgrade doesn't increase the damage at all. It increases the debuff duration. That's just not good enough when you end up with less than 300% damage on an upgraded 5-cost skill. Definitely D tier. And then Glaise Earthquakes. Now, I don't know how much attention you've been paying to the damage numbers so far, but the numbers on this one are excessively high. This thing has a 10 times attack power multiplier with perfect inputs without masks. Now, granted, it doesn't get a mask damage multiplier, but the damage without the upgrade is already higher than most abilities damage with upgrades. In fact, this has the highest unconditional base damage of all skills, hits all enemies, and it only costs 4. But then it also applies Powerful, which means you can use the Rush on Powerful and Shell on Rush Pictos for the full buff chain and use the respective buffs energizing Pictos to refill your AP. And you don't even need to match masks to get the buff chain and deal 10 times AoE damage. But when you do match masks, you can also apply those buffs to your other allies. The mask upgrade is relatively weak, but it doesn't have to be strong if the baseline is this high. This skill is so powerful without the upgrade that it basically sets a skill power floor for every single other ability. If a skill can't hit a 10 times damage multiplier or significantly contribute in another way, you can just use Glaise Earthquakes unupgraded. And frankly, most skills will in fact be weaker in their upgraded state compared to this one without its mask bonus. And you can easily get the skill super early. So yeah, this skill has no business dealing that much area of effect damage without upgrades, but here we are, and it comes with amazing buff utility for only 4 AP, completely invalidating most skills, even in different mask categories. This is an easy S tier, and this is also the reason why I wanted to start with heavy mask skills, so you guys know which ability outclasses many of the upcoming skills. Like Jar Lampstorm, less damage even upgraded, higher cost, and worse baseline buff. Not even a bad skill in itself, but so much weaker compared to Glaise Earthquakes, C tier. And then we have Cultist Blood, an interesting ability that sacrifices 90% of your life to deal increased damage. This ability is pretty cheap in terms of AP, but not health. And it's an area of effect ability, but the max damage is like 10 times attack power when you use it at full life, which is just as much as Glaise Earthquakes, so it's not really worth using just for damage. It's only good if you can turn the health cost into an upside. There are many effects that benefit you for being on low life and for getting to low life, like the shortcut Picto that lets you play again. So this skill lets you use those on your terms if you build around it. There's also a complementary Agile Mask ability, Cultist Slashes, that deals increased damage based on missing health, and Cultist Blood not only puts you into that health range, but notably also moves the Bestial Wheel from Heavy to Agile Mask, so you can immediately follow it up with an upgraded Cultist Slashes for max damage. So these skills are obviously meant to synergize like that, which is pretty cute, but in general I don't think Cultist Blood is worth it. I feel like the other characters can sacrifice health more purposefully, so even if you wanted to use the low life payoff skill, I would probably rather have CL drain Monoco's health with her Hour Sacrifice ability, which is like the highest damage skill in the game, and it's not subject to wheel RNG like Monoco's Cultist skills, which is why I think you shouldn't build around them. That and, well, the damage is not even that good, so there is some utility, but Cultist Blood feels underwhelming in terms of payoff in my opinion, and it's worthless for every other build, which is why I will put it into C tier. And then we have Sakapatate Slam, a 7 cost AoE ability. Its upgraded damage is 10.5x, which is pretty common for him by the way, but this skill deals double damage against marked targets, not including the max innate damage increase. So with the condition met, you can be looking at a 21 times multiplier, which is the highest for heavy mask skills, and this is also a single hit skill for better mask synergy. And it also has a 100% break multiplier, which can lead to crazy break buildup, much more compared to Stalact Punches, because Sakapatate Slam can deal like 5 times as much damage. So definitely a high ceiling ability. Now marks do take some setup, but Monoco himself actually has a really good agile marking ability that just so happens to move the wheel from agile mask to heavy mask for great synergy with Sakapatate Slam. That being said, it's strong but rather expensive and not that flexible like some other heavy mask skills, which is why I put it into low A tier. Next up we have Obscure Sword, very similar to Sakapatate Slam, same damage numbers, different condition, 1 AP cheaper. Now powerless is a condition easier to maintain, but it's also a condition less desirable, I would say. It's not an effect you would always benefit from, whereas marks always yield more damage, even if you don't use them to meet a condition. That being said, if your party already applies powerless, Obscure Sword will be more consistent and may be the best heavy skill to use. It's just not going to have the same payoff as Sakapatate Slam, even if you hit a marked powerless enemy, because Obscure Sword is a single target multi-hit ability that won't fully benefit from marks and deals less break damage. But I think placing those two next to each other makes the most sense, so A tier as well. Now, if you want to apply powerless yourself, we have Eveque Spear, which actually deals pretty good damage too. Upgraded and with perfect inputs, it's a solid 14x for 6 mana while applying a debuff, which means you can regain AP with the Beneficial Contamination Picto. It's really efficient. It doesn't get the crazy flexibility Glaise Earthquakes does, but you are actually getting more damage for spending more AP. So if you're not going for buff chains, this ability is well worth using. Also A tier right next to these. They're all decent skills. Another ability definitely worth using is Portier Crash. This is the most expensive heavy mask skill, but it also has the highest unconditional damage at 17.5x to all enemies, and it can break. It also has a 100% break damage multiplier itself, and as a single hit ability it takes full advantage of marks as well, which is why I think this one is better than Sakapatate Slam in general. I was hesitant to put it into S tier, but I do think it's better than the previous 3 skills, and it is worth using over Glaise Earthquakes if you have the AP. This is one of the few area of effect break abilities in the game, amazing in general, so I think that justifies the cost and an S tier rating, but it's not quite as silly as Glaise Earthquakes. Next up we have Chevalier Thrusts, a pure damage area of effect ability that deals double damage on crits. So with 100% crit rate you will end up with a 15 times attack power multiplier, which is good for its cost, and this was my go-to for a heavy masks ability before I tested every skill for damage, and it was doing a great job, but Portier Crash does outclass it in my opinion, and if you want something cheaper you have Glaise Earthquakes. Chevalier Thrusts is a strong ability, but there's no reason to use it once you know about the S tiers, so B tier. And then the support skills, Boucheclier Fortify applies shell to allies and 1 shield if you have the mask bonus. Now shields are pretty OP, blocking 1 instance of damage, no matter how high, and unlike shell, which only lasts 3 turns, shields will stick around until you get hit and stack. So being able to apply a team-wide shield is already pretty impactful for a free AP ability, but it also applies shell, which granted is the most redundant buff you can have on a shielded ally, but Shell is still a member of the Trinity buff chain, which means you can also apply Rush and Powerful, as well as restore the 6 AP with the right Pictos. Very similar to Glaise Earthquakes, but you are trading the 10 times AoE damage for 1 shield to allies. So I'd say it's an S tier defensive ability, but its utility competes with Glaise Earthquakes. And you should know the best defense is a good offense with backup Reviving Tints, which is why I'll put it just below Glaise Earthquakes. A tier, amazing if you want shields over damage. And then Cruler Brarrier for 4 AP, it applies 2 shields to an ally, and with masks it also recovers 2 AP. Shields are great, and notably this one can shield without masks. You're only missing the 2 AP. But a single target preemptive protection skill doesn't seem that great compared to area of effect shields with buff utility in general. So C tier feels outclassed by the previous ability, but it might save you. And that concludes the heavy mask skills, which have many strong picks. Glaise Earthquakes is a no-brainer in my opinion, and then you could also consider getting either Portier Crash or one of these A tier skills for a more expensive, higher damage option or survivability. And now on to caster mask skills. First off, we have Demineur Thunder, which has the highest break multiplier with a 500%, doubled to 1000 with mask, which is a crazy break multiplier. I mean, it would deal more break damage if it just would do the triple health damage with the mask upgrade, like most other skills, instead of further inflating the break multiplier on a 0 damage ability. D tier break potency is still based on damage dealt, which this skill doesn't do. Next up, Ballet Charm, a 2-cost skill that deals double base attack damage and applies powerless. There are better ways to apply powerless, and this isn't even worth a turn in my opinion, D tier. And then we have Bruler Bash. Now this one I am actually quite fond of. It's what I used for most of my first playthrough before all my testing, and it did surprisingly well. It's an almost 10 times damage multiplier on a 4-cost skill with break utility, which isn't bad at all. It's not going to get the highest damage or Glaise Earthquake flexibility, but it's, in my opinion, the best cheap break option that you might want to keep around, even in the late game. So B for Bruler Bash. And then we have Sakapatate Explosion, another 4-cost ability. This one is random targeting and double damage on crits, so ideally you critically hit an isolated enemy, in which case it's a 10.5x total damage, which is a negligible increase over Bruler Bash or Glaise Earthquakes, and it doesn't have anything else going for it. So if you wanted some area of effect flexibility, Glaise Earthquakes will deal full damage to all enemies, no questions asked, and for single target, Bruler Bash has the added break utility and is more consistent in general, so while it's not the most terrible damage, I don't see why you would ever want this conditional garbage when there are better, more reliable 4-cost abilities. D tier. Next up, Sapling Absorption, another 10.5x damage skill, but this one has the added benefit of healing Monoco by up to 30%, which is nice. But my stance on healing is that you either disable it with the Confident and Inverted Pictos to take half damage and deal almost double damage, or you use area of effect healing with the buff on heal and energizing buff Pictos to support your whole team. So single target heal is not worth it in my book, and Monoco actually has a skill that does area of effect heal and AoE damage. So while the skill isn't really bad in any way, dealing damage and healing, it is outclassed and not useful given the state of single target heals in my opinion. So C tier. And then we have Creation Void, Monoco's most expensive skill, which fires 3 projectiles that hit random targets, but if it hits the same enemy, it deals additional damage. So ideally you use this against an isolated target with its mask upgrade, in which case it deals 43 times attack power damage with perfect inputs, which is a lot, the highest damage Monoco can do in one turn. It's expensive, but it doesn't have any real conditions, so there's no reason to not always go for this if available, as this is your highest payoff skill, even for Almighty Mask. mask. And because of the high damage and random targeting, it also works decently well against multiple enemies, because the single projectiles may be enough to wipe them out, and you don't really have better AoE options for caster mask. And for single target, well, there's not much to think about. S tier, I don't think this is an exciting ability, but it deals the highest damage against single targets and works well enough for area of effect in a pinch. Next up, Benisseur Mortar, a 5-cost mediocre damage ability which switches you into Almighty Mask if used against a marked target, which I think is quite a pricey condition. Not only do you have to set it up, but you also waste the mark with a low impact multi-hit skill, so you won't have the mark bonus for the ability you're setting up. Also, when you're in Caster Mask, you're already set up to do your highest damage ability, Creation Void. But then you may say, yo JD, but you don't have to be in Caster Mask to use Benisseur Mortar and get to Almighty Mask. You only lose damage. Which is true, but if you're not in Caster Mask, you can naturally hit Almighty Mask with skills that don't suck or waste marks if you pay attention to the Bestial Wheel. I feel like having other abilities equipped will naturally give you higher odds of hitting Almighty Masks without wasteful setups like that. I wanted to put this into C tier initially, but the more I thought about it, the more I disliked the skills, so D tier. And then we have a couple of pure support skills. First off, Perelin Heal. For 5 AP, you apply regeneration to all allies for 3 turns, and upgraded it also heals allies for 40%. Regeneration is a 10% max health each turn, so that amounts to a lot of total healing. Now, regeneration by itself does not trigger any healing synergies, which is why I am not a fan of regeneration in general. You do rely on hitting the caster mask to trigger Pictos, so I think it's in kind of a weird spot where it's best used reactively for the massive heal after your team takes damage, but then you might not have the right mask. And I don't think proactive healing with regeneration is that valuable. There are more reliable defensive skills and there are more reliable buff skills in general. I have rated Luna's AoE heal pretty poorly, and this one is even conditional. The one thing that this has going for it is that you have it right away before you get the better skills, so there's a time where you can get some mileage out of this one. It can be a high impact skill, but ultimately I don't think you should ever keep this for long. C tier. Next up we have Orphelin Cheers. For 3 AP this applies powerful to allies, and with mask bonus targets also recover 3 AP. It's not bad, but it doesn't do anything that Pictos themselves can't do. You can get these effects on top of other skills, but it has a decent baseline impact for 3 AP before you figure out better support setups, I guess. So C tier, it could be worse. Like with Potier Energy, which is basically half of the previous skill, you pay 1 more AP to restore 1 more AP, but you don't get powerful, which was like the only good thing because you could trigger a buff chain and restore even more AP on top, so D tier. Just like Troubadour Trumpet, which is basically the other half, the buff portion. For 3 AP you just get 2 random buffs, no AP restoration, so pretty terrible. And that covers caster abilities. Creation Void is the obvious pick here, it deals ridiculous damage. Bruler Bash is decent if you need break utility, but the other ones are honestly underwhelming. So for the most part, unless you can use Creation Void, Glaise Earthquakes will sadly be the next best skill to use for caster masks. And now onto the Agile Mask skills. First off, Aberration Light. It's tied for the highest cost Agile skill at 7 AP. It does have the benefit of applying lots of burn in an area of effect, which is always a good thing, but for some reason it doesn't get the typical triple damage mask upgrade. Instead it just applies 50% more burn, which is just a pathetic bonus. And it's not like Glaise Earthquakes, where it just has a super high base damage to compensate for missing the high multiplier. It has average damage and basically no multiplier. So yeah, I think it's pretty tragic for a 7 cost ability to not really get the huge mask bonus, especially when agile skills are already pretty lackluster in my opinion. I think if they would just change the mask bonus to triple damage, it would be perfectly balanced as an agile payoff skill, getting the burn stacks with the average times 10 multiplier that even much cheaper skills can get. But as is, the burn just isn't enough to make up for the lost damage. I am putting it in C tier, saved by the AoE burn utility, but it just can't compete with other skills damage-wise. And then we have Chapelier Slash, the other 7 cost ability. Thankfully this one does have the triple damage modifier, although the base damage isn't impressive. It does barely keep up with a 8.4 multiplier, but it does apply Mark, which is a super powerful status effect, offering a 50% boost for the following hit, and it's an area of effect ability. Marking skills are few and far between, typically dealing low damage to single enemies, so having a decently hard-hitting area of effect ability as an agility skill is definitely great and justifies the cost, especially considering that any status effect also enables a 2 AP refund with the beneficial contamination picto. Notably, it also moves the bestial wheel from agile to heavy while applying marks in an area of effect, meaning it's a perfect setup for Sakapatate Slam, which deals amazing damage against all marked enemies. I do think Chapelier Slash is Monoco's best agility skill, once you do get cheater at least. I wouldn't say it quite measures up to the other S tier abilities, despite being the best in its class, but a solid high A tier for sure. Next up we have Echassier Stabs, kind of a sleeper ability. It's very similar to Chapelier Slash, but it's single target. It does have the advantage of being much cheaper and dealing slightly more damage, so it's actually better for bosses. And it does have the same Sakapatate Slam synergy, but I think the area of effect utility on Chapelier Slash is still more valuable. That's why I'll put this into high B tier. I just value flexibility very highly on Monoco due to his mechanic limiting your skill choices so much, but you could also make an argument that Echassier Stabs is on par or even slightly superior because of its higher single target efficiency, especially before you fix your AP constraints. And then we have Chevaliere Piercing, a 3-cost shield piercing ability that deals 30% increased damage per shield on target, which isn't all that much. Even against an enemy with 3 shields, it would deal Glaise Earthquake levels of damage to 1 target. Granted, it does ignore shields, but if it's not enough to kill, your teammates still have to deal with the shields. And even in areas with many shielded enemies, it at most only takes care of 1 shielded enemy because it's a single target skill, and you also need to land on Agile Mask to even deal relevant damage. So D tier, too situational and not even that rewarding. Next up, Cultist Slashes, the complementary ability to Cultist Blood. This skill deals increased damage with missing HP. The baseline damage at full HP is not bad actually. Just with the mask upgrade, it will be dealing damage equal to around 8.6 times attack power with perfect inputs, which is just below average for its cost, though still in line with the higher damage agility abilities, but then it obviously gets better as your health decreases, and the multiplier is quite big, giving you up to a 250% damage bonus at 1 HP. So if you build around it, you will always get that bonus, and with upgrades you can hit for around 24 times attack power, which is more than double, almost triple as much as the next best agility skill. So easily your highest damage option if used with Cultist Blood or Seal's Our Sacrifice for example, but you could also get good value if you just get hit by stuff. You don't have to be at 1 HP, you could also use it at like half HP to deal much more damage, but it doesn't have the area of effect or marking utility compared to something like Chapelier Slash. Overall, it's a strong skill, although I would prefer the marking abilities if you're usually healthy. But when you build around it, and the 1 HP builds do have many benefits as mentioned with Cultist Blood, it can deal huge damage and there's nothing like it in its mask type. So high B tier because it's best used in niche builds. And then we have Luster Slices. This is a cheap ability that deals cost appropriate damage and applies Rush to Monoco himself, which once again can enable full buff chains with the shell on Rush and powerful shell pictos. Pretty great on an ability this cheap, but there are just better buff setup abilities like Glaise Earthquakes, so it's a great ability, but it's completely outclassed. C tier. Next up, Ramasseur Bonk, the cheapest break ability at 2 AP, but it literally deals less damage than a base attack, and the masked bonus is just filling the break bar by 20%, which I really don't care for. It seems redundant, and again, if you want to fill the break bar, just use skills that aren't hot garbage, and you do have better break skills like Bruler Bash, so D tier. And then we have Lancelier Impale, a very cheap ability that applies slow, a very powerful status effect. The damage isn't impressive, but absolutely appropriate for its cost, and it comes with utility. With skills like these, you don't ever have to use basic attacks, and this ability is also fine to use in other masks if you're missing AP for higher damaging skills, and it's decently impactful with the status effect applied at a cheap cost. It's a nice ability in general, which is why I'll put it into B tier, but I also think it usually won't fit into a setup because late game you're not restricted by AP as much, and you'll want to be using higher impact abilities, and before late game, when you don't have cheater, you will probably want to use the next ability instead. which is Abyss Wind, a low-cost, low-damage skill that lets you play again, which is extremely powerful, especially for Monoco's mechanic, because you can progress the Bestial Wheel without spending your turn. The upgrade bonus is a 2 AP discount, making it free in Agile Mask, which makes this a pretty good fit in my opinion, as I consider this to be among the weaker mask types. But with this skill you can actually be happy to land on Agile, because you'll just get a free turn and skip the mask. The free turn has plenty of benefits, like triggering on turn effects such as warming up, increasing your damage each turn, or just naturally gaining an action point. And with the Nassaro weapon, which I think is Monoco's best weapon that you find super early on, you can get an additional AP on wheel rotations, so you can play again and have even more AP on the free turn if used in Agile Mask. But you could also use it without the mask upgrade to progress the wheel without spending your turn or losing AP, which is S tier utility in my book. There's no reason to not have this equipped, except as with most skills that let you play again, it pretty much loses all of its value as soon as you have the Cheetah Picto, because extra turns won't stack. So it's S tier before Cheetah and pretty much F tier with Cheetah. Just another thing ruined by the Picto, so I'll just put it in the middle at B tier. So overall, I'm not too fond of Agile Mask. I think it's best skipped with Abyss Wind before you get Cheater. Chapelier Slash is great, but on the expensive side for its damage. Cultist Slashes is amazing for low life builds, but otherwise I would probably just prefer Glaise Earthquakes consistency. Also, if you land on the second Agile Mask spot, Glaise Earthquakes will transition into Almighty Mask, on top of outperforming most Agile skills. So the best pick for Agile Mask may also be Glaise Earthquakes. And now onto the Balance Mask skills. First off, we have Go Fury, which is pretty much like Echassier Stabs, but cheaper and lower damage. For 3 AP, it has a 5.7 multiplier and applies Mark, which is a great debuff to make a cheap low damage ability more impactful in general. It also moves the Bestial Wheel from Balance to Heavy, which sets up Sakapatate Slam for a massive follow-up turn. With the cheap cost and the debuff triggering Beneficial Contamination for an AP refund, this lets you be more efficient before you fix your AP issues, and it can set up other abilities despite not being a high impact ability itself. B tier, next to Echassier Stabs. Next up, Brasseler Smash. Similar upfront base damage compared to the previous ability despite costing 4, but makes up for it by applying a total of 6 burn stacks, which is fine, but nothing crazy, low B tier. And then we have Clair Enfeeble, an area of effect skill that applies Powerless. Its damage is pretty low though, and I don't think Powerless is that great despite some synergies. It's just outclassed by many other skills, so low C tier. And then Chevalier Ice, similarly bad damage on a 6 cost skill, but this one is area of effect slow, which in my opinion is better than Powerless, but it's pretty expensive for how little damage it deals. C tier just because the debuff is pretty impactful despite terrible AP to damage ratio. And then Contorsioniste Blast, another 6 cost area of effect ability that deals around 9 times attack power damage, but also heals all allies by 10% per enemy hit, so up to 30%, which is amazing because you can trigger all the buff and respective energizing pictos on all characters while dealing decent area of effect damage and healing. It's a great utility skill that you could even use off mask just to trigger all the pictos, but in Balance Mask you can also deal decent damage. It's not as cheap and flexible as Glaise Earthquakes, but it's a decent runner-up. Amazing, but not quite S tier in my opinion, only held back by how beneficial it is to just disable your healing with the Confident plus Inverted Picto combo, and how other characters can get similar or even better utility with skills like Luna's Typhoon for example. So high A tier, don't sleep on this one. And then next up we have Mosinou's Vendage. This is basically a more expensive Bruler Bash for Balance Mask. Decent damage with a 10.5 multiplier and break utility. Low B tier, slightly worse than Bruler Bash. And then we have Chevalier Combo. This is an expensive pure damage skill where you need to hit the quick time event to even get multiple hits. And if you do, you're getting a grand total of 11.7 as damage multiplier. That's like 10% more compared to the previous skill, which costs less AP, can break, and has no fail clause. And it's already a worse version of another skill, which means Chevalier Combo is terribly underwhelming. I don't see why it has a fail clause. It sounds like it should be your go-to damage skill with that, but it just isn't. So C tier, it's not like complete garbage. You are getting okay damage, but it's garbage compared to Vendage, Earthquakes, or the next skill. Dansu's Waltz, which costs 1 more, gets the same damage as baseline without fail condition, but then also can deal 50% increased damage against burning enemies, in which case you're looking at a 17.5, which is good, but it's also just as much as Portier Crash, which costs the same, deals area of effect damage, and area of effect breaks without conditions. Now, Portier Crash is an S tier skill in a different mask, but Dansu's Waltz is still rather underwhelming for its cost, given that it's conditional single target damage without any utility, but I'll still put it into B tier because the competition for Balance Mask isn't too hot. Except for Sakapatate S-Stock, a cheap skill with mediocre base damage that gains a damage increase against stunned enemies. And that increase is a 6-fold damage multiplier, which is ridiculous. And if you consider the 20% bonus damage that stunned enemies take, this skill upgraded and against a stunned enemy gets a multiplier of 38x. That is obviously really good, but you won't always get that. It does need some luck or setup, and while very doable, one thing to consider is that Monoco's first gradient attack, Mighty Strike, also does increase damage to stunned enemies, which yields like a 40 multiplier. It's not reliant on Mask, and it puts you into Almighty Mask. Now, the S-Dog can also land on Almighty Mask if used on the second balance position, which is great, but I do think having a Gradient 1 skill as a more flexible power crept version does undermine S-Dog's value a bit. I'll still put it into A tier. It has crazy high potential for a free cost skill, but lacks flexibility, which I once again value very highly on Monoco. And that concludes Balance Mask skills. Overall, I think Contortionist Blast is the most interesting ability here. It can do so many things at once if you don't disable your healing. Other than that, Sakapatate S-Tot can yield some high returns if you have the slot for a more situational skill or set it up. Gold Fury combos well with Sakapatate Slam, and Dansu's Waltz is decent if you have an abundance of AP, but you could also just not use any of these and just go for Glaise Earthquakes once again. And then lastly, Almighty Mask skills. The Almighty Mask is capable of upgrading every single ability, but there are also 3 skills that only work with this mask. So these will naturally compete with every single other ability and have to be held to a higher standard. First off, Duelist Storm. It's the highest damage break skill. It has the upside of being a multi-hit break ability, so you can use it even if the break bar is not entirely filled, to cap it out with the first hits and break on the last one, and with its like 36x damage multiplier, it is more likely to fill that break bar. Being an almighty skill that expensive though, I would rather just use Creation Void instead to deal even more damage most of the time. Now, one argument you guys have made in my Monoco damage numbers video in favor of the skill is that it only moves the bestial wheel by 1 and thus always ends on caster mask next, which lets you use Creation Void as a follow-up. An interesting point, though it does have the condition of you having enough AP to use an 8 cost ability followed by a 9 cost ability, which is achievable by, for example, ending your turn with Duelist Storm and then have CL play Intervention on Monoco, giving him an AP boost, and together with the Nosaru weapon and Energy Master, things like that, he could regain enough AP for Creation Void. Duelist Storm actually breaking an enemy with Energizing Break could also get you there. There are also other AP battery setups like Luna's Typhoon to solve AP issues, so it is doable for sure, but it does take specific conditions or setups to make it work like that. This definitely speaks for the skill, but it still remains a super expensive almighty ability, which means it's only usable when you're in a position to do whatever you want. I just feel like you would want more flexibility rather than optimizing a niche case where you would have been fine to just use Creation Void first. So I'll put it into B tier. I can see it being used effectively in certain rotations. It is the highest damage break skill, but once again I am holding these almighty skills to higher standards, especially the expensive ones, because they won't be usable most turns and you don't want dead abilities clogging up Monoco's skill bar. And then we have Sakapatate File, which suffers from pretty much the same issue. For 9 AP, this will hit for a 26 multiplier in Almighty Mask and apply 9 burn. The nice thing is that it's area of effect, so against 3 enemies, it will even outperform Creation Void, but against single target, it's significantly worse. The burn utility is also great, and I could see you using it for that, but in general, I don't think it's hitting as hard as it should. and you're not missing out on much for not having this skill equipped. It's not like you're ever on full AP in Almighty Mask without good options. You can literally do anything, and most of the time you'll want to be using Creation Void anyways. So B tier, strong, but I have high standards for the most expensive ability that needs an Almighty Mask. And lastly, Landmaster's Light, a 5-cost AoE skill that deals increasing damage with each use. It has pretty low base damage, but it ramps up pretty quickly, adding double its base damage per use to all subsequent casts and stacking up to 5 times. I'll show you my damage spreadsheet for reference, which you can find in the description, and as you can see, the damage on the left without mask bonus is pretty low, even stacked. But with masks, it gets the 5 times Almighty Mask damage multiplier, which becomes insane pretty quickly. The second cast already deals higher area of effect damage than any other ability with a 35x, and then it only gets crazier up to a 105 multiplier, which is ridiculous. Now, it does take time to ramp, but the best thing about this ability is that you can stack it without being an Almighty Mask, and then get a massive payoff once you do hit Almighty Mask. When you use it off mask, you will deal pathetic damage, you're basically sacrificing the turn, but as long as you cash out eventually, every single prior use will basically net you a 23x additional damage for each following cast in Almighty Mask, and the no mask version also becomes decently powerful at some point. Long story short, it becomes super powerful with a single sacrificial turn, and this skill is the answer for every boss fight that doesn't just get steamrolled, because it ramps up to ridiculous levels of damage pretty quickly. So S tier, you hopefully don't need it in every fight, but if you're ever missing damage, this is it. For Almighty Mask, I think this is the only skill that's worth it, because you can ramp it off mask and then hit crazy numbers once you do eventually get Almighty. And overall, I would say you only really need 2 skills, Creation Void for massive damage and Glaise Earthquakes, which is so good that you can just use it with any mask every turn and honestly be fine. You don't even need to cover each mask because of that. Now, while I am preaching for Glaise Earthquakes every turn, I should mention that some weapons provide big bonuses for using upgraded abilities that you may be missing out on with off-mask turns, and that may be enough of a reason to use otherwise slightly weaker abilities. The other slots are more flexible, you can mix and match anything that suits you, there are many great options up to B tier in my opinion. So just pick whatever you like. And that concludes this list. Make sure to check out the other characters. Let me know what you guys think about these skills. I'd also love to hear any suggestion you have to make these videos better. Thanks for making it to the end, and I hope to see you in the next one. See ya.